Hi guys, this is Lauren with Watkins Art, and I am going to be demonstrating how I painted this fun lavender painting. Now, this is a full-length tutorial, so I am just showing you what it took to paint it in real time for me, but feel free to watch it all the way through, and then as you follow along, pause it wherever you need to pause it. I'm starting off by wetting my paper. I am using Strathmore 400 paper. This is a wood pulp paper, so it doesn't stay wet for a long time. So I am pre-wetting it before I start mixing my colors. And for this, I'm going to be using 3 colors. So nice and simple. I'm going to be using ultramarine blue, which is a blue that is closer to purple on the color wheel, so it doesn't have as much green undertone to it. I'm going to be using violet, and then I am going to be using sap green. My sap green is a Winsor Newton Cotman color, and the rest of my colors in my palette are Vinci watercolor paints. So one student color with the Winsor Newton Cotman, and then the rest are professional grade paints. I am going to be using blue in 2 different ways on this palette. I'm going to be doing combinations of blue with purple for the flower, and then I'm going to be adding blue to the Cotman color to create some variations in green in the painting. Again, this is a really simple lesson and really simple on the color mixing. Okay, so I've got my blue green and my just pure sap green, my blue and my violet. Then I rinsed off my brush really well, and now I am just re-wetting the paper to make sure it's still super saturated. You can see how shiny it is. I want this to be really wet because we'll be starting off with wet into wet techniques. So now I'm mixing some blue and purple together so I can have more of a lavender color, a blue purple color, blue violet, I guess. And I am just taking my large paintbrush. You can use a smaller one if you don't feel comfortable using your largest one. And I am just doing some elongated dabs. So they're kind of ovalish in shape. And I'm just dabbing the paint onto the paper. And you can see how that paint is spreading. That is because we are working on wet paint. Your watercolor paints will go wherever the paper is wet. So if you don't want your paint to spread or go somewhere, make sure your paper is dry. If you want your paints to move and flow, make sure your paper is wet. So I'm just doing a bunch of random dabs. I'm doing some that are more blue, some that are more purple, keeping it a little bit more varied. And now I'm just splattering some paint colors on because it just adds to the whimsy. We're not trying to be super realistic with this painting. We're just having fun. And there's something about splatters that are just fun for me. And now I'm just going in and adding a little bit more color to some of those bigger markings I did. That's because the more water you add to your paper and to your paints, the lighter it's going to be in value when it dries. And I just wanted them to be a little bit darker when they dried, so I added a little bit more color to them. And since the paper is still really wet, those dabs are still going to move and flow. Now I'm just coming in with a smaller paintbrush and just picking up different combinations of our blue-green and our just regular green, and I'm adding them to our paper. I'm keeping it very light. Again, this is the background of our picture, and so I don't want it to be too strong or overpowering right now, so I'm keeping it very diluted paints. The more water you add to your paints, the lighter in value they will be. Okay? Your water's kind of like white paint when you're working with watercolor. And I'm just doing very thin lines. You can always go back through and thicken up your stems, but it's really hard to make them thinner after you draw them. So using a light hand, and I'm just flicking in some more grass and like foliage at the bottom. I'm using, instead of just using my wrist, I'm using my whole arm for this, okay? And that gives me a lot more stability when I paint and more control, because you have a smaller range of motion that you can paint smoothly when you only use your wrist. But if you use your whole arm, you can do longer strokes that are more consistent in weight and thickness and pressure, but it does take a little bit of practice. And I'm just layering this up. And again, since the paper is wet, all of these brush strokes are going to soften up because they're going to spread out just a little bit. So again, make your brush strokes a little bit thinner than maybe what you want them to end up, because they will spread if you're working on wet paper. And again, by picking up random combinations of the dark green we mixed and the light green, we are creating depth and visual interest already within our picture, because the light green looks like it's got the sunlight hitting it. It's a little bit lighter in value, whereas the blue-green color tends to read like it's more in shadow. And so by layering that up and creating random brush strokes that vary in width and color, we are starting to create depth within our picture. So I don't know if you've noticed, but as we've gone along, the paper isn't as shiny as it was, and that's because it's starting to dry. So now with a smaller paintbrush, I'm going in and starting to block in the next layer of flowers. And instead of just doing blobs, I'm creating like little gaps within the picture. I'm just doing little random markings, and you can see it's starting to spread out a little bit, but it's not spreading out as much as it was before. And that's because the paper's starting to dry. Sometimes this is referred to as dry on wet. That is when your paper's wet, but you don't have, where you have thicker paint, so it doesn't spread as much. But it can also be your paper starting to dry, there's less moisture, and so it's just not going to spread as much. This is really great to start building up the next layer within the picture, because you start to get a little bit more detail, but it's still a little bit blurry on the edges. And so it can create, like, it's a little bit closer than those ones that we painted at first, but they're still a little bit in the distance. Now, if your paper is starting to dry and you're not getting that blurry look to your picture, what you can do is you can gently kind of mist it with some water. That's what I did with the previous one. Or you can take a clean, damp paintbrush and kind of tap over it, and that will kind of soften and blur the edges just a little bit and give you that little bit of a more blurry look. Another thing to keep in mind is don't go too dark with your color. The further away things are, the lighter they are in value. So value is how light or dark something appears. So if something, we know when we look at something from a distance, it looks lighter in value than the things that are closer to us. And so make it a little bit lighter in value. It doesn't have to be as light as the first flowers we did, but we don't want to go super dark just yet. And we're not focusing on getting too much detail. I'm just using the very tip of my paintbrush and doing some random markings, keeping some gaps in between so it doesn't look like a solid block of color. You want some little gaps where the white peeks through to help create a little bit more depth. And you can see that I sprayed that last flower with the spray bottle. It wasn't like a solid spray where the whole thing got evenly wet. The little bit of splatter that came from that sprayer created little random drops on that flower and allowed some of it to flow and some of it to stay. Okay, if you don't like that or you don't have a spray bottle, don't feel bad. Just use the damp paintbrush and gently tap over that while it's still wet, and that will soften up the edges. And just keep your values a little bit lighter. And then here is another one. And feel free to practice these flowers again before you start this whole picture. That's why I always encourage people to watch the video first before they try to follow along. That way they know kind of what's coming up and what they can do to prep for it. And I'm having my flowers vary in size, vary in location, having some of the flowers go off the edge of the paper. I don't want too many sitting right on the edge without going off, because if you have something sitting really close to the edge of your picture, but it doesn't kind of go off the edge of it, it creates a lot of tension. and it doesn't look as good. So if you want something close to the edge, feel free to just kind of have it, just some of it veer completely off the edge of the paper. And now I'm doing some more green. Again, just like before, varying up the colors of green I'm using and varying up my brush strokes. You can see these ones aren't spreading as much because the paper isn't as wet. This is what's nice with like more expensive watercolor papers like cotton paper, is that the paper holds onto moisture. It's kind of like jeans, right? If you're wearing cotton jeans, denim, and they get wet, they are wet forever. And you may not like that with your pants, but it's really great for watercolor if you are planning on working like this, where you're using lots of wet layers and you want to gradually build up your detail. But I'm just, again, adding some more of those flowers in to our picture. So this flower is part of our kind of our third layer. So we are going to be doing a little bit more detail than the previous one. They are going to be a little bit bigger in size since they're closer to us, and they're going to be more detailed. And I'm just using the very tip of my paintbrush and just slowly painting in this flower, kind of focusing on the shape more than I have been in the past, and just gradually building it out. I don't want my lines to be too symmetrical or too repetitive, because our eye will pick up on that and say, oh, that doesn't look realistic at all. The other thing I'm doing is I'm varying up blues and purples. So sometimes I reload my paintbrush and it's more blue. Sometimes I reload it and it's more purple. Sometimes I use the mixed version of them, and I'm just layering it up. But with this layer, I waited for my picture to pretty much completely dry before I started doing these flowers, because I wanted sharper lines. I didn't want the paint to flow. And so now the paint only flows and blends when I add more color to that wet flower I'm painting right now. So you can see sometimes I dip my paintbrush in another area of the picture that I already painted, and then that color kind of flows out. That's because the flower hasn't completely dried, and so the paint will flow there, but that doesn't flow beyond the boundaries of that flower that I painted, because everything else is dry. Your paint only flows where it's wet. So if you're anywhere on your paper that's wet and you touch it with paint, that paint will flow. But if it's dry, it will stay in place and you'll get sharp, crisp lines. So this is a fun thing to experiment with, because you can get color mixing in very specific areas, but you can allow everything else to stay the same. And now I'm just building up another flower. All of our pictures are going to look different, so you don't have to make yours look exactly like mine or have your flowers be in the same exact spots or have as many flowers as I do. But just try to look at your picture and think, there's kind of an empty spot. That would be a good one for another flower, and kind of build it up from there. Look at what your picture needs. Something to keep in mind is sometimes odd numbers tend to look better in our brain, and so keeping a more odd number of flowers can be helpful when designing your picture, and not having too many sit dead center. Okay, but just building more and more flowers, just like the last one. The nice thing with this is a really repetitive painting process, and so as you get to these final flowers, you've had lots of practice beforehand, which then helps you do better because you've practiced more. And you can just use the paintbrush size that you feel most comfortable with. I'm using not an ultra small one. I'm probably using like a size 4 or 5 paintbrush. It has a nice tip on it so I can get lots of fine details, but it's not so small that it can't hold very much paint. And if you are painting and you kind of feel stuck and you don't know what to do next, again, just take a break. you can come back to it. As long as you're not doing like a wet into wet thing where you need your paper to be wet to do that part of the picture, you can always just come back. And sometimes coming back with fresh eyes is really helpful. I can't tell you how many times I've been painting and I've been getting really frustrated with this picture and I just don't know what I need to do to fix it. And I take a break, go eat lunch or whatever, come back to it with fresh eyes. And all of a sudden I'm like, oh, that's what was bugging me. This thing isn't in perspective right, or this thing needs more shadows, or I need to put a flower there, or whatever that picture needs. And so sometimes coming and looking at it with fresh eyes can help. Sometimes turning your picture upside down can help. Taking a step back and kind of squinting at it can help, because squinting kind of distorts our vision a little bit, and it really helps you see value. So what things are light and what things are dark, and what things are kind of blending together that shouldn't be blending together, etc. So, we don't have to rush. You can just take your time. And I'm sorry if you can hear lots of lawnmowers in the background sounds. I never know what day the lawn people are coming for my apartment. And it's always the day that I record. It doesn't matter what day of the week it is. It's always the day I record. So I'm sorry if you can hear lots of like whirling and buzzing sounds in the background. That is just the lawn getting mowed. So just taking my time building more flowers and just painting along. And what I like about this painting, especially as a beginner, is you don't have to stress about your color mixing. Some color mixing can be really overwhelming, and it's something that takes a lot of practice. Even if you follow all the instructions, it takes time to learn how much water to add, how much water to not add, how much paint is too much, how much is too little, all of those kinds of things. And with this painting, you don't have to worry about complementary colors. You don't have to worry about any of that. All the colors work together well. And you don't need an exact color, right? Each flower can vary a little bit, all that stuff. So it just kind of takes the pressure off of painting a little bit. So these flowers, or this layer, I guess it's the third layer of flowers, you can make these a little bit darker to start off with than the previous ones, because they're going to be a little bit closer up to us visually, in our illusion of creating depth within the picture. So you can make them a little bit darker to start off with, but just remember with watercolor especially, it's a lot easier to make something look darker after the fact than try to lighten it up after you've painted it, especially if you've painted it and it's dried and it's too dark. So you can always start off with kind of a mid-tone color on this layer, and then if you want something to be darker after the fact, you can go in and do another layer of purple and blue on top of it to deepen the color. Watercolors are a transparent paint, and so you can take the same color that you painted it with and then let it dry, and if you do another layer of that paint on top of it, it will automatically be darker. And you don't have to do anything else special to darken it up. It will just be darker because you added another layer over it. And I'm sorry with my head getting in the way. It probably will be in the way off and on throughout the rest of the video because I forgot to angle my board. And so that means I am leaning over it a little bit more to see what I'm doing as I'm adding more detail. I've added some green into the little gaps on some of these flowers to make it look like the stem is extending upward. And I'm adding some more stems to it. Some of the stems I'm having go behind flowers, and some of the stems I'm having go in front of them, just to help create more of that illusion of depth. Okay, we are working on a two-dimensional medium, right? Our paper is flat, but we are trying to give the illusion of depth. And so having things overlap, some things go behind other things like that, it can help create that illusion of depth within our picture. And just adding some more foliage, just building it up gradually, having some of those stems be longer, having them be shorter, all of that, just building it up as we go along. So just going in with some more stems, and then I'm going to start in kind of on our fourth layer of flowers. So these ones will be kind of the biggest ones. They'll be a lot darker in value to start with than the previous layer, and they'll be a little bit more detailed than before. So you can see lots of dark purple paint, and I'm getting the blue in there. If you want to color swatch your paper, feel free to have a scrap piece of watercolor paper to kind of swatch your colors on. That way you can see what they're going to look like before you add it to your paper. Sometimes it can be a little tricky to know just by looking on the palette, especially when you're first starting out. So now I am just painting in this kind of last layer of flowers, and you can see it's a lot darker than the previous ones. I'm still using a smaller paintbrush so I can get lots of detail in, and I'm just taking my time like before, just building it up. Okay, just little branches and using the tip of the paintbrush to get lots of fine lines, keeping the strokes random so they're not too similar or symmetrical. I'm having some of the layers blend together, some of them having little gaps so you can see the light kind of peeking in through them. This is actually a fairly similar technique to how you would go about painting pine trees. But instead of painting pine trees, we're painting flowers because I love flowers. I spend a lot of time out in my garden because I love flowers. And my lavender was exceptionally pretty this year. And so it was just on my mind when I was like brainstorming watercolor lessons for my college classes I was teaching, which is what this demo is for. And I was like, I think lavender would be a really fun flower to paint. It's not like a trillion petals that are symmetrical like a dahlia where it's just a lot of work. And this is a little bit looser and more fun, especially when you're just learning watercolor. And sometimes all those details can be extremely overwhelming. So you can see this lavender plant, a lot more detailed. I'm just going in with a damp, clean brush, and I'm just kind of smudging some of the areas and blending them in just to create a little bit of variation within that flower. And now I'm coming up higher on my picture, and I'm going to be doing another one. You can see my hand kind of going back and forth. That's because I'm kind of figuring out where I want to put it for sure before I start. Okay, always take an extra second to kind of figure out where you want something to go before you jump into it. And just dabbing in that paint using the tip of the paintbrush. These paintbrushes I'm using, I found on Amazon, and they are real hair, and so they hold a lot of moisture, but they are very big for their size and for what you pay for them. And they have kind of become my workhorse paintbrush. I use them all the time. I have one set for my backpack for my classes that I teach, that I take with me, and then I have one set for home. and I just have really enjoyed using them. I think I spent like 12 bucks on them or something, 14 bucks when I bought it, and I feel like they're really good value for what you get. And now I'm just painting more flowers. I know it's really repetitive, and this is why I usually end up speeding up videos, but I wanted to give you guys kind of a real time so you got to see how long it took me to paint it. And feel free to pause it wherever you need to, and don't be discouraged if it takes you longer than 40 minutes to paint your picture. Okay. This was not my first time painting this picture. I did a couple practice rounds before I recorded this one, which then made me faster, right? And then I have a lot of experience painting, and so that automatically makes me a faster painter. I know sometimes in my classes my students get really discouraged because it takes them so much longer to paint something, but just like anything, if you have practiced something a lot, you will pick up on it a lot faster than somebody that has only practiced something a handful of times. Like my mom is a fantastic pianist, and she can sight read music. She can learn a new song after just a couple times practicing it, where I haven't played for 20 plus years, and it would take me a long time to play, and it would take me a long time to figure out how to play. And that's because I have chosen not to practice that. But anything that we want to learn in life and become proficient in, we need to practice. And so what differentiates someone that can paint and draw from someone who can't is just the desire to continue to practice that skill. My husband doesn't like painting, and he doesn't love art. He likes to look at it, and he likes to look at what I've created and what other people have created. But for him, it is not enticing. It's not something enticing enough to go practice and spend his free time doing. Whereas if I could spend all my free time painting, I would. Does that make sense? Hopefully. I'm just kind of talking to myself in the room in a quiet house, so I don't know. But just painting more flowers until I feel like my picture is looking good and balanced. And again, take a break if you aren't quite sure if you need to add more or tweak and adjust things. I'm having some of the flowers kind of taper downward a little bit at the base of them, towards the stem. It's almost like a pine cone shape. These almost look like purple pine cones now that I think of it. But just painting some flowers. Some of them are a little bit bigger, some of them are a little bit smaller. I just want it to look like you are bending over looking at a bunch of like lavender type plants. And now I'm rambling because this is a really long video. So now I'm going to have another flower kind of going off the edge of the paper, but I'm going to have it coming from the opposite direction. So you can see the flower above it looks like you can see the base of the flower, but you can't see the end. And this one's kind of reversed. You can see the top of the flower, but you can't see the base of it. Then I let it dry, and now I'm just coming in and adding the stems to those more detailed flowers I painted. They don't look like they're floating too much, but some of them definitely do. And so painting in those stems will help them feel more anchored in the picture and not like these random flowers are just floating in the sky, defying gravity. I don't know, maybe it's really windy and they got blown away. But we're just adding the stems, again, just taking my time. You can always go back in and thicken them up after the fact, but it's hard to make them thinner. So use a smaller paintbrush that you feel like you have control over, and then go and add your stems to the picture. And you can see sometimes I'm like going back and forth, like, which one do I want to start with? Sometimes I find that being left-handed, I find that I tend to work like right to left. I I bounce around a lot when I'm working, but sometimes I tend to work a little bit more right to left. And that's just a survival skill with being left-handed, because like if you're writing, I remember like in school when I would write notes and stuff in class, my whole left hand would just be super smudged, and it was because I was dragging my hand across. So with painting, I tend to work opposite. That way I don't have to run the risk of smearing my paint or dragging my hand through things. The bottom right corner of my picture, there was something that got smudged on that paper. I don't know what it is. It was from manufacturing, and the paint wasn't really absorbing in that section. So I go over it multiple times, and the paint kind of would just bead up and be lighter in value. It's almost like a wax was on it or something. Just letting you know. If you don't want too much of a halo effect around like the base where your stems are at, have your paintbrush kind of start off the paper and then pull upward, and that will help prevent like weird halo effects around the painting. Or if you are pulling downward, have your paintbrush pull all the way off the paper so you don't get like a weird halo or glow around the edges of your painting. And then I'm just doing some more flickering and just building up more of those branches. I guess it's not branches, more like stems and leaves. Then I set a scrap piece of paper down and where I didn't want green to go, and then I started flickering some green at the base of my painting just to kind of mirror the purple that we did earlier, and just to create some texture and kind of whimsy effects within the painting. Again, I just wanted this to be kind of a fun, more loose style painting. I tend to paint very detailed, very sharp lines, and lots of layers. And so sometimes it's fun to just have a little more fun, be a little bit looser with things like splattering paint. Now I'm splattering some purple on the painting because why not? The difference between this and the splattering we did earlier is this isn't going to spread and move like the last one. Now I'm coming in after I let it all dry and just doing a few more layers of paint on some of these flowers just because I wanted to darken up some of the areas. And by having some areas that are a little bit darker within those petals and some of them be a little bit lighter and building these layers, we're going to create a lot more depth within the flower. Okay, because we're going to have lighter values, darker values, overlapping colors, all that kind of stuff. And that will help create a little bit more depth and visual interest. Just try to make sure the areas that you paint that are a little bit darker, that it's not too symmetrical, too similar. That first one I did, I almost had like 3 straight lines, and I would try to vary up those shapes just a little bit so it's not too like obvious. And I obviously wasn't paying attention to my camera situation, and so half of my picture that I'm working on right now is off screen. Then I'm just coming in and doing this one on the side. And you'll see like I'll paint for a second and then lift my brush and then look at it and then paint some more. I think sometimes we'll watch like YouTube videos or videos on Instagram or TikTok or whatever, and they're sped up, and so we don't really get an appreciation for how long it can take to paint something, and how much work and time it goes into. And so we can be like, wow, we're really slow at painting, or, you know, they're so much faster than us. But really, our perception's a little skewed because we're watching it sped up and not in real time. And some painters are really fast in real time, but most of us are kind of slow. We look at it, we pause, start painting again. And a lot of that stuff is edited out as well. It's not just sped up, it's cut. And like even this video, with it being painted in real time, I still cut out probably 10-15 minutes of pauses, or I'd pause and look at the picture, kind of see what I wanted to do, and then paint again. Like I edited out a lot of that without speeding up the actual painting footage, just so it's not like 5 minutes of me just staring at the painting, seeing what I want to do, because that'd get a little boring, and that would make voiceovers even harder to do and keep entertaining. So we are on the homeward stretch of this painting, just kind of getting those last details in, looking at what the individual painting needs to be tweaked and adjusted, seeing what things need more shadows, what things need more highlights, what things need to kind of be reinforced, like branches that need to be made thicker, or stems, all of those kind of things. Look at your individual picture and see what it needs. So you might take a step back from it, kind of squint and see, oh, these two flowers are kind of blending into one big one. So maybe make one of them a little bit darker in value so it kind of stands out a little bit different, or making it a little bit bigger so it's not the same size as something next to it. Look at what your individual picture needs, because even if you try to follow this exactly, yours is still going to be different than mine. And that's just the nature of watercolor, and that's just the nature of painting, right? So don't be afraid to make tweaks and adjustments based off what your individual picture needs. And don't be afraid to paint this several times, because you'll learn something different each time. And look at your first picture and kind of evaluate that experience and what you would want to do differently. And then go do it again and implement those changes that you wanted to do. And I have had experiences where I've painted the same thing 3 or 4 times, kind of back to back, or, within a week of each other, to kind of push my boundaries and learn from each experience. And then I can line up all of those pictures and kind of see what I liked and didn't like about each one, and what I would adjust. So don't be afraid to, just because you painted something once doesn't mean you can't paint that same thing again to learn from it. That can be also a really good gauge if you are feeling discouraged in your skills as an artist. Go back to an old tutorial or reference photo that you did before and try that picture again, and then compare it to the first one you did. Sometimes I don't feel like I've progressed very much, and then I'll look at my sketchbooks from even a year ago or 2 years ago and realize how much I've improved as an artist. And that just comes from regular practice. So this picture, I'm just about to call it done. I would probably tweak and adjust it even more. But I'm about ready to call it done. And I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial and you found it helpful in learning how to create depth within your picture, learning how to do wet into wet techniques, dry into wet, and then wet on dry. And wet on dry is when your paper is completely dry and you put wet paint on it. And that's where your paint doesn't shift or move. And then here is the close-up of the painting once it was all finished. I hope you guys have a great day, and I hope you found this tutorial helpful. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.